Would like to thank Abhishek for jumping in last minute and saving us after an issue. Abhishek, if you want to introduce yourself to the teams as well before we start. Sorry,
Hi guys, my name is Abhishek, prefer pronounce Hide.
Thank you so much. Okay, with that being said, on the motion, this House supports a widespread implementation of San Pedro's prison structure. I call the Prime Minister.
Cool. Can I confirm I'm audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. 4 claims from opening government in this debate: what the status quo is, why our comparative is better, then multiple principal justifications as to why this policy should be implemented, finally the economic and social benefits. Before I get into constructive, 4 points of important framing. Note firstly, we think the implementation of this looks like the implementation in places where there are financial resources to do this. This is not an overnight transition in all places, so they can't claim that this will be done with lack of access to funding or done with a snap of the fingers and an immediate sense. We support like gradual transitions where it is necessary, and we support immediate conversion where we have funding. Secondly, there will still be deterrence, and the media will not be covering every minute and live stream within these prisons. So if OP tries to claim that the prison doesn't look so bad and therefore this increases the risk of people doing crimes as the result of no deterrence, given that there's no direct transmission or live stream in and out, and prisons are still reasonably restricted, even though family members are allowed and other members of the public are not in, this is still some reasonable degree of deterrence, and it is unlikely that mass media coverage of this will cause massive recidivism or like offenses, and you cannot pick your community and you still have to live near other prisoners, so there still represents a large degree of deterrence in the status quo. We just think this balances better the priority of giving prisoners rights and also deterring crimes. Thirdly, note that prisons by themselves on our side of the house give governments an incentive as a result of the motion to ameliorate conditions within them. That is to say, when you invest money within these individuals, you give them some living conditions as a byproduct of just the motion being implemented, because at the point at which you're able to derive economic labor and therefore the benefits and external benefits to the economy as a result of these prisoners working, you necessarily have to care about keeping them in shape, because even if they're literally never going to get out of jail forever and have life in prison no matter what, to the extent that the society can still reap productivity from them within prison, and note the motion fiats they can work within prison, therefore it is likely that these treatment will be somewhat reasonable. Finally and fourthly, obviously the most extreme violent cases will likely still be in solitary confinement. Note that the civilization within the prison has an incentive to put these people away, and the majority will probably want to, given that if they don't, the society doesn't work and the elections don't work, and also government has an incentive to secure the functionality of this. So if a lot of these are being disrupted by really violent prisoners, presumably the government can interfere to stop that. Let's explain the status quo. Note that in the status quo, prison represents a genuinely cruel and unusual punishment. Note that in their very best case, the Scandinavian model, which OP can't try to prop, but might try to prove will happen via likelihood analysis, there are still significant restrictions on agency. This looks like limited conjugal visits. Your spouse cannot visit you regularly, limited familial visits, an inability to derive meaning from your labor through employment, an inability to vote, the access your preferences and see that extracted upon the world, the inability to interact with people outside of prison, constant vulnerability to abuses of power, however marginal by guards. And this is in their absolute best case, where I'm giving them everything and conceding that the Scandinavian model exists today. Note that in the worst case, and they have to prove it's not the worst case, it looks much more like the prison industrial complex in the USA, which is horrific on a million levels. It brutalizes and subjugates minority bodies, and it segregates life from them, often through long sentences that they did not deserve, and they quite literally never get out. Why is our comparative better? Why do we rescue thousands of these people, millions of these people, from significant abuse? There are 5 broad reasons here. Firstly, we give people access to agency. This is important because insofar as agency is a prerequisite toward accessing one's conception of the good life and fulfilling one's preferences, we give prisoners more options to do so. Now they have an option to pursue a career. They have money within prison which they can use to buy goods and services from other prisoners within the career, within the civilization. They can vote, which is something highly meaningful as it represents an expression of one's preferences and how you wish that can shape society. This is hugely validating on a principled level. Secondly, human beings inherently want to work because they derive satisfaction and meaning from it. They like to be able to have money. We rescue these prisoners from ennui and an endless lack of opportunity by putting them back to work and giving them something that is a goal to work toward and strive toward, thereby making them more fulfilled. Thirdly, we get better rehabilitation within prisons because these people interact with a broader civilizational structure that is not structured around a single relationship of like guards brutalizing you and other prisoners brutalizing you with no laws whatsoever. This means that when they get out, they are likely to be more functional because they have effectively already been rehabilitated through living within the society. Fourthly, they get exposure to families. In the status quo where conjugal visits are limited, you can often lose hope because you are restricted from the outside world to a significant degree. When your family is close to you and other families are close, you give these people emotional connections that they can latch onto. Fifthly, these prisons are likely to just be more safe. Note that because families, women, and children are there, the centralized authority of prisoners has an incentive to rein and disrupt prisoners to a huge extent because quite literally if a woman or child dies there, this could undermine the entire civilizational structure. But note that reining in dysfunctional prisoners is super important, and naturally, given that the elections are regular and the motions essentially gives us fiat to say they work, enforcement mechanisms likely exist. But more importantly, even if you don't believe we can just say the enforcement mechanisms exist, note that if, at the point at which which like people don't want to work with you within the government if you're being actively disruptive and causing a mass anarchy, I think it's probably likely there are inbuilt incentives to discourage this kind of violence because you are unlikely to get your demands met if you don't work within the structure that has regular elections. Finally, and sixthly, reduce recidivism, because at the point at which you get out, you probably won't reoffend. The reason why people reoffend in status quo is because prisoners cause you to lose faith in society, and you are separated and abstracted from your own emotional being, and you have no idea how to reintegrate. We expose people to a simulacrum of society within this prison that makes it significantly easier for them. Two observations before I move on to my second point. Op does not have fiat in this debate, as it is supports to explain. They have to explain the likelihood of alternatives emerging. Why won't they emerge? Firstly, most of these alternatives have not worked and have been not proven to reduce recidivism. Secondly, there are likely to be massive pushback to that at the point at which they don't balance rights of victims properly. So if you reduce sentences massively on their side of the house, or just abolish prisons, which they obviously counterprop, this would obviously undermine faith in the judicial system significantly. Finally, lobbying power of prisons is massive. On our side, they likely accept it because we give them a massive financial cut in terms of like they no longer have to employ prison guards. They now make more money. They probably accept it. On their side, if they still employ those people, it's probably quite bad. Why is this principally just? Two reasons. Firstly, this is a principled balance between the public interest, safety, and reducing recidivism. We think this is an extension of the principle, which is what prisons exist to do in the first place. And insofar as I proved through my first point, you get better rehabilitation. And I've incidentally given you significant likelihood analysis as to why these prisons will be safe. I think this is principally justified. It is also democratically fair for prisoners to express their preferences in this manner. It's the same reason we consider democratic societies to be just. Given that majoritarian rule is the closest thing toward assessing the preferences of the majority to a large extent, I think it is significantly good on our side of the house for them to be able to do so. Before I go on, I'd like to engage with closing opposition.
Why is more agency an objective moral good when it comes to punishment?
Because I think that insofar as prisons exist in the status quo of wanting to balance the ability for people to emerge from prison eventually and reintegrate into society, but at the same time providing justice for victims, they are succeeding at one, justice for victims, and failing at the other. On the weighing, I prefer a world where these prisoners have more access to agency because they are still human beings and do not lose fundamental moral value at the point at which they are imprisoned. But even if you don't believe that, note that the state still derives economic and social benefits from implementing this. I think it's significantly better at the point at which we balance these things better and they integrate better into society as a result. What are the wider economic and social benefits? Note the likelihood analysis I've already iterated in my first point that I'll explain again here, noting that the society, as a result of elections, has inbuilt deterrence mechanisms toward anarchy. Families being there increases the level of safety. Prison guards not having to be paid decreases the amount of political capital that lobbyists in the prison industrial complex has to make these conditions really terrible because there are literally no guards within the motion. All this means this is a functional community. What are the three benefits of this? Firstly, you incentivize society to respect the rights of prisoners. This is crucial because at the point at which you have the ability to extract more economic capital from these individuals within the prison and then also down the line, as their money still flows into the economy, there's still goods and services, they can presumably give money to their family, and then the family spends it outside. This is an economic benefit. You incentivize the society to want to rehabilitate them and provide better living conditions over time. So even if we can't figure out these living conditions are great in status quo, they become better over time as a result of this incentivization. Secondly, economics. You get the money multiplier within prison and literal remittances going out of this civilization into the broader community. This is significantly good because many times single like Black fathers wind up being in prison. People who are outside wind up being unable to secure economic capital to a large extent. Finally, resource trade-off. The money goes elsewhere that is no longer paying prison guards and so on and so forth. The state can probably do better things with it on our side of the house. Like, I don't know, implement welfare or something like that. I think all of those reasons are great. I think I clearly weighed out agency. I think I'm proud to win from Prime Minister.
I have the Prime Minister for their final speech. I call upon the Leader of the Opposition to start the Caito opposition bench.
Cool. Am I audible?
You are audible.
Amazing. Give me 1 second. Alright, starting in 3, 2, 1, let's go. I'm going to talk about two main things in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the perception of prisoners and why that matters in terms of how the rest of society engages with them, and how, secondly, then that feeds into the overall perception of justice that we have and what that means for like the societies in which these prisons likely exist. Firstly, a little bit of clarifications as to like the stuff we hear out of opening up and what we think the things that we stand behind. One, I don't think we need to defend literally the worst kinds of prisons. I think probably we can also push for prisons that have like better reforms. I'm genuinely unsure why comparatively like there's less support for better prisons on our side of the house. I think at the point at which you're more easily able to demonize prisoners, which is going to be the bulk of my case, I think you're probably more able to like push for harsher reform and less reform for those prisons in general. Overall, we think comparatively on our side we still have better ability to get better or more people to buy into the fact that prisoner rights are probably something that we ought to care about at some point. Secondly, then the idea that like necessarily the main civilizing impact that we get out of like the prison system that OG stands behind is the fact that people can work. I'm really unsure why this is something that is excluded explosive to their side. Note that in the status quo, people work in prisons all of the time. Like, note importantly that most prisons aren't just like high security prisons where you have literally nothing at all. Most prisons do have things like rehabilitative things like education, because note that it's really fucking expensive for the state to not provide prisoners with anything and then have lots and lots of unemployed people come out of prison at the end of it. Note that in the status quo, they oftentimes give you skills, they give you employment. I'm unsure why this is necessarily different or why this is necessarily exclusive to their side of the house. We say it is literally not, especially given that most prisoners or most people in the prison population aren't actually like high intensity criminals or whatever that have to be like locked up or are under special supervision in the first place. They're oftentimes people that have done minor crimes and therefore like are not in like high security prisons anyway, where you don't have access to any of the better things like education or like work in the first place. Notably, I think it is probably worse on side opposition, where you're literally more coerced into working in the first place than you probably are in prisons in the status quo, because note that on their side of the house, you literally have no baseline level assurance as to having your basic needs fulfilled. You literally need to work in those prisons now because you need to pay for your own accommodation and for your own food and for your own basic living standards. We think that's just a worse comparative in terms of one, how you have to work or how coercive it is for you to work or the kind of work that you're likely going to be doing. So what then happens on our side of the house? I think it's important to understand that one of the greatest harms that exists within like the prison system or within like how prisoners are treated within society and what that means for rehabilitation and the way in which like criminal policy, for example, is drafted is oftentimes the perception that we have of prisoners. That is to say, it results in the treatment of prisoners both whilst they're in the prison system, but also way beyond them, i.e. the reason why people are unwilling to give them jobs or give them education or engage with them in any kind, or why we have the demonization that leads to lots of harmful or feeds into lots of other harmful narratives in the first place. What does this look like? I think it's important to note that at the point in which you have this kind of prison system, a couple of reasons as to why the perception of prisoners gets worse. One, I think people feel that criminals don't respect order in the first place. Note that those are the overarching narratives, i.e. that these people do not adhere to the kind of rules that the rest of society has agreed to and the rest of society continuously follows. Importantly, giving them the kind of freedom that exists within the system that OG proposes necessarily reinforces those narratives and says that those are people that are fundamentally anarchic. Note that I don't think it matters how well run these prison systems are. They might well be super well governed and super like lovely and like great and like giving people all of these civilizing effects that OG wants to talk about. I don't think it matters at the point at which that is not the thing that people are likely going to believe. Note that I think specifically politicians that take a hard on crime or tough on crime kind of stance, or specifically media has the incentives to hype up these prisons as being incredibly dangerous places and as being like necessarily places of anarchy and places where specifically criminals are doing things that people already believe criminals do all of the time. I think irrespective of how well they are, I think probably this means that people have a worse conception of how like anarchic or how like disrespectful like criminals necessarily are. Two, I think people are also willing to less willing to engage with prisoners as a result of this, at the point in which they feel like these prisoners literally don't get any chance of change. Note that oftentimes it interacts with narrative of saying that prisoners are fundamentally corrupt individuals as opposed to, and are there because of like their personal failings, as opposed to, for example, structural reasons which force them into situations of crime or force them into cycles of having to use crime as a means of livelihood in the first place. Note that at the point in which there are literally no outside people within those prisons, people now believe that there is no ability for these prisoners to ever reform and ever get better, and therefore escape the or like shake off the kind of corruption that people think these people have experienced. Note that I think this means they don't think these people can be reformed. I think this means they have a worse perception of them. Thirdly, I think it is simply easier to demonize these people now at the point in which you feel like justice isn't being served, because note that you feel that they have disrespected order in the first place and they have literally harmed other people. I think the rest of society now thinks that they're significantly worse because they specifically feel like no punishment is being served, because these people are just living a nice life and they're experiencing freedom and not having their freedom taken away. I think that people perceive this as fundamentally unjust and therefore are unwilling to engage with those people. Fourthly, I think this feeds into how specifically you make associations between harmful narratives and prisoners and criminality in the first place. I think it becomes more likely that people now, for example, it reinforces and magnifies the kind of harmful, for example, like racist discourses that people already believe about why some people are more criminal than others. I think that fundamentally gets worse because you're now better able to demonize those people and draw kind of like tangents between different communities. I'll take closing.
Most of the world is broken windows policing, people electing politicians being tough on crime like Donald Trump, and public prosecutors jumping into politics based on statistics of persecution. I would be incredibly amused that you're trying to find a comparative of demonization there.
Yeah, look, note that I think probably, at least in the status quo, we have some incentives for people to want to change the kind of system, because now that people do recognize that the system is kind of broken, I think fundamentally you get zero chance at having any kind of reform for those people at the point at which they are now seen as inherently never getting any kind of punishment, right? I think at least when you're able to be in prison and say like, oh, I served 5 years, but also I learned carpentry while I was doing it, your potential employer is more likely to want to give you a job otherwise. We think on balance of probability, it's still higher on our side of the house than it is on your side. We think that is still better. Note that I think importantly, these civilizing structures that OG wants to talk about don't give you jobs afterwards if people think you are fundamentally unsafe or you're someone who disrespects justice. Note that also this feeds more so than just the treatment of prisoners. I think it feeds into general narratives that people have of justice. I think at the point at which people think that justice isn't served, they're more likely going to, right, like just feel unsafe overall, or feel, for example, like they don't need to cooperate with the justice system anyway, because there's no point in it, because literally whatever happens, no justice is being served for the people that disrespect it anyway, and they're forwarding more supportive of more harmful narratives. Lastly, we think life inside these prisons is probably likely shit. Note that this is literally just like shittier capitalism, and we think, at least in our comparative, we have a baseline of needs or baseline of services being provided to those individuals. They have no assurance on opening government or inside government that this happens on their side of the house. We think probably it is also just unsafe to the extent to which there is no accountability within there. We think it is easier to use violence in order to get kind of positions of privilege. We think probably this hurts the most disadvantaged individuals within that system the worst. We think you have no assurance to get them any kind of safety or get their basic needs met for all of those reasons. Opening opposition.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for their fine speech, and I'll now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the case for side opening government.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Cool. You know the drill. POIs in the chat. I know that CEO will take as well, because otherwise will be shame. So I will also take one from them. Cool. Just don't unmute yourself. 3, 2, 1. What I will say in the beginning is crucial for this debate. This is the extension of current existing narrative and more effective management. Why this is true? First of all, we recognize that people have basic right to keep dignity. We're giving the prisoners beds. We're giving them seeing visitors. We're giving them ability to left if they are having the good placing in there. We are allowing for reopening cases later. We are allowing lawyers to fight for rights of these people. But also, unless you put everyone for life sentence, you expect them to come back to the society. The limitations we have and the problem with prison systems are twofold. First of all, the financial spendings from the state budget that people don't want to pay for all of this because they don't think that these people are worthy. But second of all, about the internal functioning of these prisons, that you feel that this is just perpetuating that people not getting successful rehabilitation. What Matt told you, that this balance the public interest of giving people the punishment and limitation. Because look, we were in the pandemic when people were locked in their buildings and people were complaining a lot. I don't think that this is no limitation or no restriction. You can go to holidays, you can't use all of the resources, and you are only basing what is in this building. This is the extension, but not the extreme extension as opening opposition is trying to point out. But B, you are still in isolation, right? You can't get weapon, you can't get the field, you can't get the access to hurt other people if you did that in the past. That means that this is the effective management, because if you are getting lots of the economical benefits, or if you are trying to make these prisons less dependable on the government budget, and you are giving these people some ability to also being productive after they leave there, I don't think that opening opposition engage at all with this. But second of all, their case, it's contradiction. They're trying to mitigate us by saying, in our prisons, we are also giving the jobs. The next claim which they're making constructive is, we are not giving people jobs because we don't think that then they are getting the punishment and people don't want them to express their freedom. I think that op need to decide what is their opposition bench. But second of all, at best, this is extremely limited case, right? Only works in the best case scenario of prisons. And it's also unclear if this is something which people will support or if people will enjoy. But secondly, and most important, I don't know why public is the main recipient of this message. Couple of points on this. First of all, you are not going, watching through the window and saying, hey, are you still in prison? Are you still suffering there? No, like no one taking care. You are happy that they're in the isolation, but also you don't voting for death sentence, or you want them come back to society at some point, because you realize that sometimes that the structural mistakes of the system, when these people beside being perpetrators are also the victim. But B, you believe that people can change. Many narratives like religion or justice telling you that, which means that it's unclear why this public will be so extremely opposed, especially when in the status quo we are seeing that people accepting prisons to some extent. But furthermore, as well, there will be no direct daily news from BBC, from England, from each prison. This is how election look. Let's talk with this leader. Is there anarchy here? No, it will be quite closed system, not available to the public. So it's unclear how the perception of this anarchy will be created in the heads of the people. But most importantly, they need to prove that this is priority for the people, that they will take care more than other policies, or than being somehow safety. You are not codependent of these people anymore. It's unclear why there are more important actors than people who are being harmed and people who are exercising this as their daily life. Therefore, I don't think that their rebuttal, this is shit capitalism, it's enough to take down Mark Hall analysis. I wanted to also pause that there are two types of people, at least, who are going into the prison. The first, the people who come there for the short period of time, right? Who are failed by the system, who didn't have the good parents, who didn't have the good environment, good neighborhood, and they felt that this is the good way to do. These people on their side of the house are subject of being more likely exposed to the harms. The rebuttal to this is very simple. If you see the women, children, families in the prison, but also if this is connected to your well-being, to your respectability, you are less likely to perpetuate the violence, but moreover as well, you are seeing some sort of purpose, right? You want to have better bed, like 3-star bed compared to the other person. So you are likely to find some profession, which means that you are not wasting your time, not losing the hope into the system, which means that after you leave this prison, you will be far more likely to be a better person. But second of all, as I said, even if you were the criminal, even if you made a mistake, if we on both sides of the house believe in the rehabilitation process, the question is on which side of the house we are better capable to achieve this. I think Matt said very important line, that there are 4 prerequisites of successful rehabilitation which ensuring come back to the society, which we are giving the people. A, you're giving them the contact with the outside life on a daily basis, right? Your family and showing you what you are missing, that they want you to get back, but also you can more express spending time with them, which means that you are also less likely to hate all of that stuff. Second of all, about the range of services, about the job, how that increased to some extent competition, and how you allow to still feel like a human being in this building, in this small community. We believe that this is incredibly important. And thirdly, about the elections, that you can decide of these policies, that you finally can find your system of justice based on the majority. I don't think that the majority of people voting in prisons have less right, the majority of United States speaking with Donald Trump on their president and deciding who will be doing this. This is unclear for me why this is comparatively worse than in the status quo. Before I move on, closing opposition.
Yeah, do people buy and rent cells, as is in the info slide, with money they make outside of prison or inside?
I think the info slide is quite clear, right? That's about the internal prison system. But I think what is important to note in this round, it's A, what is the comparative and what the opposition needs to stand for? Not the best version, but the status quo and what's likely to happen. They never engage and tell us why this is justified for these people, especially with the coexisting narratives. But I wanted to talk also about more important way in this debate. A, who will take care in this debate? This motion doesn't change the life of ordinary citizens. It's exclusively impacting the life of the prisoners. I think Matt previewed on multiple metrics why it's better to function in this community than on the opposite metric. When you're also seeing the guards, when you're having the problem with the imposition, when you're having lots of issues and you can't handle with this because you feel external authority, which you are likely to combat in the past. We believe that this is better. But second of all, if op claim is that these people didn't deserve like to get back or they need to get punishment, they will serve the punishment for themselves inside there if that will be their choice, if that will be the majority of willingness. We believe that there will be still some sort of fraction, there will be no massive anarchy. Therefore, we believe that opening government.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their fine speech, and to finish the case for side opening opposition in the top half of the debate, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Am I audible?
You are audible, yes.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, taking down the principled stuff from opening government. Secondly, talking about public perception and rehabilitation. Lastly, about life in prisons. Firstly, principled stuff. Like both of the two broad things that opening government wants to say is like, you get access to agency and work gives you meaning and you'll kind of like deserve those types of things. I'm unclear why these are the principled justifications for this, and I don't think they provide any else. I think that firstly, agency is probably something that is a cool thing, but I think that at a point at which they are limiting the agency of those prisoners outside of prison, I'm unsure why this is the trade-off that you should be making. At a point at which Vicki has extensive analysis as why your life outside of prison is going to be worse, you're going to have more stigmatization outside of prison, and the likelihood that the laws such as like, you can't vote even once you get out of prison are going to get passed on our side of the house. I think you're just limiting future agency. I'm unsure why that trade-off is meaningfully better. Secondly, I think that like opening government doesn't tell me why voting is the only way you're able to access your agency. I think lots of people who don't vote, who either choose not to vote or who are unable to vote, still have access to agency, like e.g. kids. But I also think that like voting isn't the only way you are able to access your agency. Like generally, you're still able to make choices about your life within prison as well. Unclear why voting is that one very specific mechanism you need to do. The second thing that they try to claim to you is like, work gives meaning and that is the thing that matters the most in this round. Genuinely unclear why that is something that is exclusive to their side of the house. Literally in the status quo in prisons, yes, they do work. I think that the American prison complex, the problem that they want to talk about, they just don't realize that those prisoners are actually working in those prisons. I think that if the thing that their main mechanism for change is access to work, but also like the thing that gives people meaning, you are able to access that on our side of the house, in addition to many other things that you are able to choose. I don't think they have a principled claim. I'm unsure what they're relying on. Let's talk about like rehabilitation and the way we are able to change perception, because the main core claim that Vicki gives to you is that the way in which these prisons have crucially their perception, and notice this stands independently of whether rehabilitation actually happens or not. So all of the 4 reasons that Matt outlines are actually meaningless at a point at which people don't believe those prisoners are going to be rehabilitated anyways. But let's go through those 4 reasons and why they're not actually achieving them or why they don't work. First thing they say, you need emotional connection to family. I think you still get emotional connections you can form with your friends within the prison, or you have visitation rights on our side of the house. Secondly, you're taking away the emotional connection you're able to access, you and your family are able to access later on once you're outside of prison, because people are unwilling to like talk to you and engage with you. I think that is a worse harm than you as an individual prisoner being stripped from emotional connection. Unclear if that is meaningfully going to change the rehabilitation status that you're going to have. Second thing they say, you get a feeling that you live in a society and that is the thing that gives you rehabilitation. I think that one, you don't have access to any external rehabilitation that oftentimes does help people, like I don't know, psychologists or like people who genuinely live like this, like we live in the society outside of prisons. Unclear if that is actually true. I think probably like the values and behaviors that are being exhibited in those prisons are oftentimes unlikely going to be exactly the same ones as outside of prisons. At a point especially which you don't have like things like guards, you literally don't have the police, and you don't have like proper laws that you are abiding there, or like anyone is enforcing them, or if they probably are, they're probably using lots of violence to enforce them. I think at that point it is unlikely that you're going to get good living in an outside society feelings out of this. I think like rehab is something that you crucially lose out on at a point at which you're later unable to integrate. Third thing they say is, you're not going to reoffend at a point at which you lose faith in the society. This is contingent on your experience actually being good within that prison. Notice they do absolutely no analysis as to why it is likely that you're going to have a good experience. The only thing that they say is you're able to vote and things are good. No idea why that translates to a good society. We live in a capitalist society in which we are able to vote. Most people are fucking unhappy in this life. Unclear why they have a good life in that society. So I don't think you actually gain any type of faith in that society. I think at a point at which you see the outside society doesn't match the expectations that you had or the life that you had within the prison, you're much more likely to get disappointed again, or you feel like like people aren't accepting you. You are likely to reoffend because you don't think the outside society is the way it is. At a point at which you are exposed to some type of the life outside, it's going to be probably even more sad that you can't be a part of the real one. So I don't think that you're able to get that aspect of rehabilitation. The last thing they say is, we're incentivizing people to care for prisoners' rights once we do this. I think that the premise of their case, and like the premise of their entire thing of like people are willing to do this, the amount of fiat they have is that they already need to have some type of care for prisoners' rights in the first place in order to grant this. I think that this is something that is symmetrical on either side of the House, because this is the prerequisite for this motion, so we co-opt all benefits for this. What did Vicki tell you? Vicki told you at a point at which prisoners are seen to still as to have too much control, or they think that people know that there is no external rehabilitation in those places. Families are living there, so I think they also think that the families are corrupt and criminals as well, oftentimes overlapping with things like racial profiling. They're much more incentivized to take away any type of funding that you would have in those prisons. Their sense of justice goes down, and you have increased push for things like over-policing, which results in even more prisoners, which I think is a complete harm, because it like overstates all of the other harms that we have. The only thing opening government responds to this, but it won't be seen to the external world. Like, right, I don't think I'm watching prison live streams right now, like on my computer every single day, but I still know what the situation in prisons is like. What are the conditions that solitary exist, that guards are there? I think this is the amount of information that is available to the public, especially if this is a policy that needs to get passed on a government level. That response doesn't work. That means all of Vicki's mechanisms still stand. The other thing they say is that, like, but if you work for this society, you're going to care, like, people are going to care for it because you have economic reasons for this. Notice that you're not working for the rest of the society. You're literally working in the society. You're cutting the hair of other people within the prison. Like, read the info slide. At that point, I don't think it's even likely that you're going to be using that money to spend somewhere else. I think that because, like, the families will probably need to pay for the, like, accommodation that they live in, given that it's a capitalist society. At that point, they don't get their economic mechanism as well. I think change is significantly more likely at a point at which on our side, you're at least able to show, I don't know, like, you can, I don't know, evoke compassion with the fact that, life in prison is so bad, and like their life is constrained, or whatever is the way you want to do this. I think at that point, you're much more likely to get change on our side. If rehabilitation works, there's going to be less push for things like, let's use statistics to show that crime is so bad, and push for like tough on crime stances. If we actually have meaningful rehabilitation, the amount of fiat we have for things like a bit better prison is the same, and especially at a point in which the rest of the society doesn't hate prisoners, I think that this is meaningfully better. Life in prison is something that actually does get better. OG says, but like, you're not dependent on the state, and that is something that it inherently makes it better. At a point in which you still rely on state infrastructure, you still are probably reliant on the state to some extent, so that argument falls out of this as well. But I think many people in prisons also come from like low income backgrounds. I think it's just really shit if you force them to pay for everything there in themselves. I think a communist society in which like everything is provided to you by the state and you don't necessarily need to work for it and pay for it is something in which people are better able to actualize their agency and don't need to struggle against the capitalist societies that you also have outside that is detrimental for absolutely everyone else. I think this incites violence, this causes inequalities, and the life is really, really bad. Vote opening opposition.
I thank the Deputy of the Opposition for their fine speech. I think they're on the top half for a good debate so far. To open up the back half and to continue the case for side government, the member of government. Okay,
clearly audible?
You are clearly audible.
Thank you. In that case, I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. It's a shame DLO didn't engage in the POI. It's uncomparative, however. They've avoided those 15 seconds. They will not avoid these 7 minutes and 15 seconds. What is the problem with the entire opening opposition case? The problem is that it lacks a comparative. As I said in my POI and got no response, the status quo in terms of prisoner demonization is literally things like broken windows policing, things like 3 strikes and you're out, sentencing guidelines made across ethnic lines, politicians being elected on the idea of being tough on crime, prosecutors entering politics based on their prosecution stats. Literally after the horrible murder of George Floyd, we have an entire movement of tens of thousands of people demanding reform. I dare the opposition bench to name me one. It's amusing to see them struggle find the comparative there. The reason why they did not find a comparative is because they do not examine the reasons behind why people do not integrate in society. Incidentally and amusingly enough, also something open government also misses. So let's talk about integration. What is the reason as to why people cannot integrate after prison, even if the prison system is fairly rehabilitative in the status quo? Number one is the mechanism of fear, not the perception that prisoners are dangerous people who deserve to be kept off the streets. They're unable to participate in society and have shown so before. Very often we perceive them as irreparable, as having certain urges they cannot control, and as having psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies, given general perception of prison society, also spurred up by popular media, but also by politicians, as I've said before. This happens prior to opportunity, because the perception of this fear is what's going to make you not offer them a job. It's going to make you not let them enroll at university. It's going to make you cross the street when you see them and cause the feeling of hopelessness that they will never again integrate. This then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Insofar as people are denied these opportunities, very often they're economically forced into recidivism, which then reproduces the narratives and stereotypes around prisoners. But secondly, Know that the prison system in the status quo is notably opaque. What prison life is like is left to people's imagination. Know that we see prison life as a bunch of barbarians being held behind steel bars, a life of gangs, drugs, violence, and blood, also amplified by popular media, amplified by shows which do the gore and do the blood to get watching ratings and to get box office proceedings, things like video games, GTA, and stupid shit like that. Which means that people just have a reinforced perception that prison life is incompatible with civilized society. The problem is therefore that even if the opposition bench can prove that the prison system is functional today, it is incredibly unlikely that people get opportunities when they leave it and are therefore still likely to return to that system. What is the shift then? The shift is that this policy allows a window into functionality while allowing people to remain safe. Fear is the prior mechanism to giving them an opportunity. Insofar as they're still locked up, you're better able to rationally from a distance perceive the functionality of the system and to see them engaging in things that have a pretense of civilized life. Opening opposition responds by saying there are no outside people in there, you don't know. Families, shockingly, are in the info slide. So these people, yes, can go in there and then talk to other people, and then people talk to other people. This is usually what people do. But secondly, we don't need this to be a reality show to have media coverage. No, this is a fucking revolutionary policy shift. It hasn't happened outside of Bolivia, which means that the media is going to extensively report it, not on the individual lives of prisoners, but on the details of this system, noting the things that prisoners are going to do, but also noting the reasons of government officials and criminal experts as to why the system works, which are stories you would not get otherwise. But also secondly, not outside of Scandinavia, you're now more likely to get reporting of the Scandinavian model because this is the only fucking existing analogy in the world, which means that people who were never before interacted with the reasoning as to why the system is good, now interacted in the same mainstream media outlets they read every day and have a veneer of objectivity around. But lastly, note that this model just corresponds to the general idea of civilized society, because you see these people working, you see their families living in there and sharing stories about how they're happy, not battered and bruised. You see these people going out to elections. This is the reason why we don't have backlash in fucking Scandinavia, because we have a perception that they're engaging in the same type of life as we do. Why is this important? Because one, in contrast to opening opposition, if the public is the most important actor, we're at least more comparative insofar as they did not have a comparative, and we prove the prerequisite for agency outside the prison. Towards opening government, this is one, prior to OG, because even if they prove their benefits within the prison, they're absolutely useless insofar as you do not get benefits outside. But secondly, even if opening opposition is correct in rebutting opening government and the system is not ideal, this benefit still stands and is therefore more universal and more absolute than that of opening government. The response coming from opening opposition is, but functionality is going to be shit within the prison. Know that even if you don't buy any of OG's incentives as to you want to have a better apartment or whatever within the prison, this is quite an exclusive privilege, right? So everyone knows what prison life is like, even if you haven't been in there. It sounds absolutely horrible. If opposition is correct about the amount of demonization towards prisoners in the status quo, and given that prisoners have a conception of what the fucking alternative is, which is going back to an ordinary prison, they have a vested incentive to keep the system functional, because they know that given opposition's own characterization, should they create and manufacture one single scandal, they're going back to the system before. Now opposition may say, but you cannot count on them to do this. We do it in the status quo. That's the fucking reason most people follow laws, not because we deeply believe in them, but because there's a sanction that follows as a corollary to those laws. But secondly, know that this response to functionality is also a precondition for the open government mechanisms to happen. I've given you a number of methods why this leads to integration. Lastly, I'm going to have a lot of shits and giggles on the principle, because trying to preempt it, smart, OG, execution, not good. I'm going to do it better. Before that, I'm going to give a chance for opening opposition to engage.
Yeah, people think criminals are bad, not prisoners. That belief comes prior to the prison structure. But if it's true that people think prisons are anarchic already, giving them material proof is probably worse than ever getting them to care about prisoner rights. Unsure why families giving interviews can shake these incredibly strong narratives.
People don't care about anarchy in prisons. They care about what they think happens in prisons in the status quo. Insofar as you give them more of a semblance of a civilized life, this is at least a contrast and at least more comparative to your case. Secondly, demonization is non-comparative. On the principle, Matt just says balance and democracy is good. That's not a principle. What is a principle is the following. Know that punishment is not an absolute indictment of one's character. It means there are consequences pursuant to certain actions, but we still allow you to have a retention of dignity. That's why we respect your human rights. That's why we give you certain basic rights. If opposition wants to stand for the idea that punishment is an absolute indictment of one's character, they have to support the idea of the death penalty, because that is the only penalty that absolutely disqualifies a person from being part of society, and therefore as they're non-human, we can apply different guidelines as to harming them, different than we do towards humans. The consequence of retaining the characteristics of a moral actor is that you retain the basis that defines a moral actor, which is the right to maintain your own dignity. Insofar as dignity cannot be defined objectively, because even if there were an objective definition of dignity, we cannot access it, and the metrics to measure it are necessarily subjective. We have to defer to individual definitions of the good. We achieve this in this model because one, not only do we give them voting rights, but secondly, we give them ability to achieve skills applicable outside of the prison, but also to control their time and routine within the prison as well. 2 points of weighing why this matters. First of all, because even if they don't exercise it well, the ability to do that is inherent to the human condition. Otherwise, opposition has to support an untenable case, which means that this is true regardless of the practical. But secondly, independently of this, note that the state very often owes a reparative duty to prisoners because it has victimized them, created structural conditions for crime, criminalized their very identities. This is independent of the prior justification. I've won on the practical and the principle. Xiao-ke, it's been an absolute fucking pleasure. So proud to win one last time.
I thank the member of government for their fine speech, and I call upon the member of opposition to continue the case for side opposition.
Please put PYs in the chat. Everything that GovBench says is contingent on what these prisons are going to look like. So their principle about agency and on people perceiving prisoners best is contingent on these prisoners being like flourishing utopias rather than absolute like horror shows. I'm going to be doing two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to be characterizing why these prisons are going to be terrible, structurally extremely violent and extremely majoritarian. And then secondly, I'm going to give you a bunch of independent principles of what the prison is going to look like, about why this is a horribly unjust system. Onto what these prisons are likely to look like. And I'm going to interweave like the preemption with all the things that GovBench tries to say. The first thing to say is that the most violent people are the ones who are likely to get elected. There are two structural reasons for this. Firstly, individuals who have the longest sentences are going to be the most likely to be elected, and they tend to be the most violent. This is because people who commit the most horrible kinds of things, like murder and form of assault, are just given the longer kind of sentences. The longer that you're in a prison, you are more likely to get elected because you just have more connections. You've established an increased level of familiarity with other people. You've also importantly amassed the highest degree of money within the prison system because, as Klaudia says, it's like internal forms of currency. Meaning you're better able to do things like, I don't know, bribe people by paying off their cell to like a larger extent, or get them forms of like narcotics and dish those out to a larger extent. You also just understand the prison network a lot better. That gives you a lot of like soft power. So you know where things like the drugs are being funneled into the prison and then can become a supplier to a much larger extent. The second reason for this is that violent people are just better able to use intimidation tactics to get elected. Like the Gov frame here is like, oh, but why are you going to elect the violent people? Because you're freaking scared of them, right? Like if someone says to you, I'm going to kill your family member the next time that they come and visit the prison, or you threaten to like cut off someone's finger if they refuse to vote for you. Like I know that this sounds quite grotesque, but given that we are literally talking about a prison where you're presumably combining very, very violent and non-violent offenders, these are all things that people can do. And I think that insofar as like our bodily security is our most proximate need, fear is going to be a very, very powerful motivator over who we're able to vote for. And unfortunately, it's hard to change the structure over time because as soon as one group becomes dominant, because they've just been in the prison for a long period of time, they can then continue to weaponize forms of fear over other people. The second thing to say is that all accountability max that GovBench tries to say are virtually impossible. I just want to note here that in the absence of any accountability in like an anarchical state, there's going to be huge degrees of violence. We're talking about violent criminals who often have violent urges, who've been exposed to that. They were willing to violate bodily autonomy in other ways. There's also incentives to do things like form gangs in these prisons to guarantee forms of safety absent of guards in particular. But also, given that the jobs that you are getting are not paying you like real wages, or just paying you prison wages, which is also what flips the GovBench, you know, that money things, because like you're not being paid unofficial wage. You also want to be able to do things like integrate into criminal network to have connections on the outside world for the same reason that people do this under the status quo. Therefore, GovBench needs to give us incentives why this won't happen. The first thing that we hear from opening government is, oh, we can just put people in solitary confinement. I think that firstly, there's huge risk of retaliation of like individually doing that happens if a guard doing it. So if you're seen as being a snitch, other people are going to come after you. I also think that if someone else has like a weapon, and given that there's often like more tools in these prisons, or a family member could smuggle it in, you're also just going to lack the capacity to do so, even if you want to. Then I think that CG's thing of like we might move back to the old model. Like guys, like one prisoner who's making a choice over whether they want to kill someone is not going to think, oh, maybe in 10 years there's going to be enough political capital to move to a different kind of prison system. Under the status quo, at the very least, we have guards who are better able to mitigate the kind of violence that exists. Like it's not perfect, but they're often armed, they're often trained. If you do something against a guard, you're going to get a strike, and your sentence could be extended to a much larger extent. Why is this really strategically important? It flips the closing government case because you're just going to end up perceiving people worse in prisons or even more violent than the status quo. It flips the OG principle about cruel and unusual punishment, even if you believe that that's an objective moral good. And we actually get more positive impacts, right? And I think that a higher likelihood of being killed when you have like violent thugs running the prison, or higher likelihood of bodily assault, is probably more important than any potential economic impacts, insofar as it's often permanent when you experience forms of severe bodily harm, even in terms of like emotional trauma, or if you literally die. I also think that their economic impacts are quite mitigatory, insofar as you're not being paid an actual competitive wage. Before I get into our principal stuff, we'll take OG.
Majority of prisoners are not currently violent and only live under fear because they cannot self-actualize through preference verification. If you are violent on our side and run on a platform of I am an evil axe murdering pedophile, this is not
like you're not going to run on the platform saying I'm an evil axe murderer. The point is that other people in the prison know that you are, because you've just had threats to them privately, and therefore that stuff is going to be dangerous. But here's a bunch of principles why we win independently. So the crux of our general principle is that the state has an obligation to guarantee equal treatment as a moral necessity of all people. Under our side of the house, the state has comparatively more control over internal forms of prison conditions that exist. Number one, how prisoners are treated under their side is just influenced by how I choose to treat someone else within the prison, rather than any kind of state authority. Number two, you have no guards to police anything whatsoever. Number three, quality of life is determined by the arbitrariness of how much money you have in the prison. States are not perfect, but at the very least, you have guards to a much larger extent. Why do I think that control over how punishment is dished out is a moral necessity? A few independent things. Firstly, society has a claim in order to determine how punishment ought be dished out, which you can influence under our side of the house, but at the very least, things like legislation, which broadly outline what they expect the reasonable person to be treated in terms of things like, are we going to abolish solitary confinement or not, versus literally just prisoners choosing this themselves. The first reason for this, as I hint to OG and PY, there's no objective morality that exists, which I'm running for like the second week in a row. I don't think that there's anything that says agency or tough on crime or low on crime policies approach, but rather, given that moral systems have chosen different punishment, these are based on highly subjective moral preferences about what we actually value at the end of the day. And for the most fair way to do this is to centralize majoritarian preferences. Secondly, in order for a law to have any value, we need to have control over what the implementation of that law is going to be. Like, if we voted to ban murder, but the punishment of murder is like pulling out someone's hair, that's obviously not going to be a justified law, because all laws that we vote for, which is our basic democratic right, are inherently hung on power over the implementation capacity of what those laws are going to look like. Therefore, control over punishment is linked to all kinds of fundamental democratic freedoms. Thirdly, when someone commits a bad act, it's not just an act against an individual person, but it is an affront to society as a whole. It creates forms of fear, and you're violating forms of laws that the rest of society literally voted for. Opening government says that they want prisoners to have a vote, but I would argue that society is a far more important actor to have control, which is also going to frame any top-half clash about prisoners being the most important actor. Number one, this impacts a far greater majority of people. Any time that you choose a punishment is also reflective of your own moral preferences about what you actually think that punishment should look like. Therefore, they commit a moral affront to every person within society. But secondly, society has a comparatively more, a greater degree of innocence that exists relative to individual prisoners, where yes, moral culpability for some lesser forms of crime might not be 100%, but these crimes often still harm society. Maybe I think that society has a reparative obligation to influence crime to a larger extent. But secondly, I also think that punishment ought to be issued in accordance with moral culpability that actually exists. First degree and manslaughter ought to be punished differently in terms of things like the kind of prisons that you're going into. Under their side of the house, how much you're punished is literally driven by your wealth. If you have more employable skills, you're going to be getting better jobs in the context of a prison, or in terms of how violent your crime was, which in turn is going to mean that you stay in prison for a longer period of time, and therefore you end up getting better treatment because you have more money in the context of that prison. Therefore, I think that they ignore fundamental claims to consent into punishment because of how severe it is, and they treat people arbitrarily rather than a metric of moral fairness. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing opposition.
I thank the member of opposition for their fine speech, and to conclude the government bench, specifically closing government, I call the government whip here.
Please POI me by turning on your videos and waving. I will probably take... Don't know. Depends. This whip will be very simple because I don't need anything else to win given Tim's speech. So first, CO. CO main contribution boils down to there are structural reasons why these prisons are likely to be violent. Let me take you through 4 sets of responses. The first is just an analysis of what's best at keeping order in this prison, because they say that the violent offenders are likely to rise to the top. Intuition pump why this isn't true. Our current societies are ruled by presidents who are not the strongest and the bravest warriors, but rather those who are the best peacemakers. Historically, this pattern has repeated itself for hundreds of thousands of years. It's why we were able to survive compared to the Neanderthals. The reason for this is because fear is a fundamentally flawed mechanism for enforcing order, because while it gets people to concede to you in front of your face, it means that they immediately turn their backs and try to form coalitions against you when you're not in this. I think these prison systems are highly likely to be this kind of context because the vast majority of prisoners are not violent offenders who aren't like used to this, but rather people who are jailed for petty crimes, for economic reasons, and who therefore have a strong incentive to band together. But second of all, the other main reason is just a comparative of what people fear the most. I genuinely think that people fear not having their hands chopped off, but rather the fear of losing ability to make decisions and backsliding into the absolute shit show that is the status quo. The reason for this is because the risk of incurring physical harm on their side is a very uncertain one and depends on many circumstances, such as, will I be chased around by this person? Or when will I be able to, like, can I transfer myself away, for example? Whereas I think that, and it also applies to those who are the weakest, whereas the leadership are the ones who have the strongest mandate and the desire to make sure that we preserve this current system, because the external government still exists and believes in human rights. If prisoners are going the Hunger Games on each other, that's an extremely clear indication this experiment has failed, and therefore we need to take it apart. But the third thing is just, I think that the comparative is much, much worse. It's ironic that they say there is going to be gang violence on our side given how bad things are in the status quo. And the reason for this is because the reason why people resort to violence and drugs in the status quo is because that's their only choice of surviving, right? Gangs are your only chance of safety, and dealing drugs is the only way you can get basic necessities like cigarettes. I have no idea why Naomi says that there are no positive incentives because it's prison money. Prison money is money when you live inside a prison. You can use it to buy chocolate, use it to buy sex, I don't know, use it to buy haircuts, all of these basic things that make your life worth living and motivate you to behave. But final piece of thing to put the nail in the hammer, the nail in the coffin, that is, I think they rely really, really heavily on guards as a mechanism to maintain safety. Guards are shit. 3 responses. First is that I think the guards are, the ratio of guards to prisoners is very, very small for profit reasons. The implication of this is that prisons is a default to extremely easy but dehumanizing mechanisms of crowd control. For example, only taking prisoners out for 20 minutes a day to walk in the yard a little bit, keeping prisoners restrained for the vast majority of time, which forces them to deal with horribly inhumane conditions, which arguably are worse than the risks that they have because this oppression is constant. But the second thing is that the power asymmetry that happens, that exists between prisoners and the guards, is the guards have literally nothing to be scared of because they always can claim self-defense. They have a strong camaraderie and have full control over things like CCTV and tapes, which means that they don't care about genuinely finding out who is at the bottom of the trouble or about justice. They just want to get it to shut up and go away so that they can carry out their jobs, which means that there is no law and order, there is just fear. But the final reason why guards are bad is because the difference between the uniformed guards and the handcuffed prisoners creates a dehumanizing perception, which means prisoners are treated worse than the dirt by these very guards. I think that you inflict more harm than prisoners do upon each other because they're equals. I think that it's too late for Matt to kind of come back and try and save it in Whip. Unfortunately, I love you. Yeah. Okay. Then let me talk about OO. So their case is 2 things. The first is that conditions are quite bad, and 2, that the backlash is, going to cause people to be harsher on crime. So I think that the conditions thing I've already rebutted. So on the backlash thing, I think this is where Tin's extension on people's perceptions is really, really important, because it's not the case that people hate prisoners because we think they're anarchists and they're inadequately punished. The very concept of anarchy is a big brain thing that requires several degrees of thinking to arrive at, which means it's not able to stir up bestial feelings of fear and disgust and rage. Even if someone is an anarchist or is breaking rules, you don't feel the desire to punish them and be vindictive unless you see them as subhuman, in the same way that if my child misbehaves, I'm not going to want to lock them up in jail forever. So the bottom line is the most important thing is to increase empathy. And I think that Tin gives you many mechanisms why we resolve this with no engagement, because they just rely on the extension. The first thing is just that the desperation in prisons is status quo, and the subjugation breeds violent self-defense, which precludes empathy. But remember, just things like penetration, exposure to the general public, things such as having political systems and more connections, all of these things one, beat the OU case on hard on crime, but two, also prove that we are able to access integration, which is the most important impact on the ground. First of all, because I think the majority of these prisoners are going to spend the most of their lives outside of this, and we want to save the 20, 30 years they have afterwards and make sure they're able to live comfortable, meaningful lives. And I think that Tin proves, I fear, is a defining factor when it comes to employment. But finally, I will just say there are lots of external reasons why integration gets better as well. One, people are able to contribute, keep their skills sharp, return to the workplace more easily. But also the worst case is that prison is literally a place where you can lead a safe and fulfilling life. I think we prove this the most cleanly. I think we probably win this debate. Before I go on, I'll take OO. CO.
Yeah, so in terms of caring about forms of backsliding, why would you prioritize that over someone who's literally threatening yourself or your family in the short term, which is obviously necessary in allowing all future rights, meaning that you lack violent people who have shown to care less about empathy and who benefit more from violence by keeping the culture of fear?
The first thing is I think that probably exists in the status quo insofar as prisoners have an extremely limited ability to organize. We resolve this because we have a literal society, i.e. you let people on their ability to keep you safe, to organize guard shifts, to make sure that there is no fear and terror. You do things such as make sure there's basic law and order, because the worst case scenario, the prisoner's dilemma is like horrible. Finally on OG. So first they have a liberal sprinkling of benefits. We provide key links by proving why we can trust prison leaders, and we prove exclusivity better than fiat. But second of all, the only material that's really weighed properly by them is the principle, which is not a wise decision because Tin is very good at principles. We improve on this in two ways. The first is we prove why it's not just morally desirable to improve conditions for prisoners, but that it is an absolute moral right. Because a baseline humanity that Tin proves using the intuition pump of death suggests that we have an absolute right to change our material conditions and maintain dignity. But second of all, I think CO adds that a bit of principle, but they just prove that punishment is legit, whereas we prove that punishment may be legit, but it shouldn't be implemented in this way. And moreover, it's often very, very structural, and people are not to blame for the things that are forced to commit by society. I think we've won.
I thank the government whip for their fine speech, and now call upon the opposition whip to conclude the case of CO, the opposition bench, and the debate as a whole.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Absolutely love to see it. Just one moment. Great. I'll probably take a PI. We'll see who from. We'll see who gets lucky. The greatest irony of the previous speech, and indeed the previous case, was they tried to call out Naomi for not having much of an extension, while at the same time running literally verbatim the exact same mechanisms for opening government, except with one addition to the principle. This debate is fundamentally one about sovereignty. Prop wants to create a separatist state of prisoners, which they will condemn the worst offenders, opposing them and putting them in front of worse gang violence, sleeping in pigsties because they don't have the money to afford anywhere to sleep in the prison. And they also, at the same time, rip away the ability of the majority to reflect back on what punishment will eventually oppress them in the future as well. This was an inhumane policy, and it was quite strange that the last speaker only decided to spend 10 seconds of response into that entire principled analysis from Naomi's speech. Firstly, on agency. Secondly, on why we get a better world. Finally, on why their side condemns prisoners to terrible lives. On agency, this debate was obviously a trade-off on agency. OG says you want to prioritize the agency of principles. CG echoes this and then adds a frame about how humanity is incredibly important, probably the same thing that OG said when they talked about dignity. Why is broader society more important? Because I want to point out the humanity of broader society is also oppressed in the instance in which the state can lord over the ability to punish you, the ability to oppress you, the ability to literally kill you in prisons if you do not have the ability to reflect back on that. Firstly, it was just that they're like numerically more. Guys, I know that this is like really simplistic weighing, but if there are 10 million people in a state and only 3,000 people in a prison who are oppressed, obviously we should care more about those who are having their rights ripped away from them in those prisons. But secondly, one group has disobeyed the rules of society by taking advantage of the benefits afforded by society without getting back. And I want to point out, this justification is not hung on proving that the state or punishment is justified from a state perspective. It is instead an affront to the dignity of the rest of the members of society in the instance that they are not able to control that punishment themselves. Because it is the fact that the state, even if it is unjust, also oppresses those people symmetrically. So in the instance that you take an extra bit of oppression by trying to kill them, trying to rape their wife, etc., this is also something that is absolutely abhorrent. Finally, the more important thing here is the fact that the only way a law can ever be justified regardless is if there is an extension of the punishment of that law. An illustration here is quite simple. If I say you are banned from murdering, but if I only rip out your hair if you murder someone, obviously that is not a legitimate law, because a law is only legitimate if you both have a ability to say it is wrong and also the ability to say the extent to which it is wrong. That is to say how much you should punish for that extent. Therefore, the only way that all of those laws that tell us what to do, that rip away our humanity and our dignity, are legitimate is in the instance that we are able to reflect back on that. Even if, and I want to weigh this against all practical claims, even if SciGov proves that everyone gets retributed a lot better, even if they rehabilitate everyone, this is unimportant, rather compared with the population's ability to democratically reflect back on that. We can influence the constraints. For example, we always allow people to judge whether or not they should have economic policies that they like. I'm allowed to vote in a free trade policy, even though given the last round, I'm probably not that good with econ. But the point here is that the person, the individual, even if they are not completely informed of all the externalities of a decision, know better than a state which is literally diametrically opposed and is oppressing them. Then they say, well, it's about humanity. There are two things to say. First, as I already pointed out, the humanity of everyone is already oppressed. But the second and more important thing is there are also democratic constitutions which exist to protect those people when they're supremely oppressed. This is actually what has happened in the United States, where in many instances, state supreme courts have, or state federal courts, whatever it is in the United States, have brought down and taken away things like the death penalty in those states because they're often seen as unconstitutional in those instances. So basic human dignities can be protected by alternative means, but the only ability and way to ensure the democratic right to vote for these individuals is if we're able to give them all that power. So basically, the conclusion of this is we've already won this claim in this round from that principled analysis alone. Secondly, before I move on, OG.
The ability of states to extract labor from prisoners with a life sentence on our side of the house and economic benefits means the state has an incentive to ensure conditions are better than the status quo, where there's no social benefit on their side of the house. We also explain the majority has a limited incentive to work with people who are violent because they want to live. We're very glad CG chose to spend their extension repeating us.
This would be, this would be an unfortunate claim, but for the fact that they would have to also support prison labor, which currently exists, because you would have to say, the state obviously wants to benefit the prisoners because they're doing great work for the state. They're, making loads of lumber or whatever. If the state cared, then prison labor would be really, really good. They'd have an incentive to care regardless because people already work, right? So obviously that claim is incorrect. Next. The real reason why things are getting better on our side of the house is because CG and OG, because it's the same claim, misidentify what the reason for why people hate prisoners is. It's not because they perceive them to be bad in and of themselves. It's because they fear the crime themselves, right? And obviously then you associate that with the person. Like if someone is likely to commit a crime, you're really scared of them. And so therefore rehabilitation often actually does genuinely work at changing someone's perception, i.e. if you have two criminals in front of you, one of them you have been reasonably told and viewed has rehabilitated, you are more likely to care about that person typically. And this suggests to us that in the instance that you are able to care and ensure that the person is less likely to commit a crime, that is what people genuinely care about. This is why research that has recently come out, for example, in places like Norway, as well as in states in the United States that have used similar programs to those in Norway, have been really impactful at changing perceptions of the legal system. Because now it is a case that is perceived that the best way to change, structurally change the system, is by actually fixing it from within and doing things like increasing rehabilitation, right? So the only way to solve crime, which I already just proved is the biggest thing that people care about, is through that sort of rehabilitative lens. And so there's a positive incentive for people to use their votes to care about that. The issue is that doesn't happen for prop side, because it's not the population who can sympathize with those individuals caring. It's instead the prisoners themselves. Now, XK has several responses, and I want to go through each of them. The first is that, you're just going to elect a president because, Obama or whatever. Obviously, we're not going to have Obama in these prisons. These are much smaller areas, so you can intimidate people on a much larger scale. But secondly, look to the ethnic tensions that Naomi already mentioned. The fact that you're likely to have gangs that are supremely oppressive themselves, who are doing it on a larger scale, and then are thus able to kill loads of people. This is literally what would happen in MS-13, for example, in El Salvador, literally would control an entire prison, slaughtering people senselessly. The second thing is they say, but you fear the abstract loss of agency more than you fear getting your hand chopped off, more than you fear getting your child killed when they come to prison. I think that is supremely unlikely, as Naomi pointed out in APOY. All of this suggests that it is incredibly unlikely that they actually get a good offense system. Now, they say guards are terrible. Two things. Firstly, guards are also prone to the same incentives I already just talked about. So as prisons are generally getting better in society, and empirically it's kind of true that over time, as more research comes out, they have, those prisons get better, but they don't get better on their side of the house. So the guards, sure, they aren't holding batons, they're holding shivs and are stabbing you if you do something out of line. You are forced to sleep in pigsties on their side of the house. This is both bad for rehabilitation, because it's less likely you get a genuine humanity, but it also responds to CG's extension, which was also present in OG, because you're more likely to view these people as inhumane when you're literally seeing them stabbed in the street. But finally, you're unlikely to get change and backlash because obviously you don't have an intimate connection with the prisoners themselves, as OG points out themselves. But more importantly, like there's an immense amount of inertia at changing systems, as Naomi already pointed out. We are very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition whip for their fine speech. I think everyone thought it was genuinely a very interesting debate, and congratulate all teams for making it to the final. You'll find out results later. Org, if it's okay if we could have a breakout room or something for the judges.
Yeah, we're on that now.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Breakout room is just opened. If all the panelists could go in there, that would be fantastic.
I can't see it. Can I be sent there, please? Or
Sure thing. I'll send you in.
thank you.
Hello. I don't have. Same here. Also can't see it.
Okay, I think I've got everyone in there now. Just making sure that I haven't missed anyone.